presentation. All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for spending it's the afternoon now on the East Coast. I know some people it may still be the morning, but thank you for spending your morning and early afternoon with us. My name's Caleb, and I'm joined by my colleague Dominic, and we're we're actually founding members of the Tau Beta Sigma Diversity, Equity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Committee. And today we'll be talking with you about the concept of implicit bias and exploring that. You see a little bit of information about us on the screen. I'm from the Epsilon Alpha chapter at the University of South Carolina. Dom, do you want to share a little bit about yourself?
Yeah, sure. Good afternoon or morning for everyone. It is afternoon for me. I'm in the East Coast from Cleveland, Ohio. I'm a member of the Epsilon Iota chapter. This is from the University of Akron. And really exciting to be here with everyone.
Yep. So that we can understand who all's in the Zoom space, if you could share your name and what chapter you're coming from in the chat. Dom, you can go ahead and advance the slide. All right, so this is our outline for the workshop today. We're going to start off with discussing ground rules that's going to frame our conversation, and then we're going to delve into exploring implicit bias, starting with the definition. We have a couple of activities. It was our goal that this is a really engaging presentation, so we're going to make use of activities and discussion. We're going to be talking about different forms of bias through the Cognitive Bias Codex. We have a video, Peanut Butter Jelly and Racism, to explore how implicit bias can then feed into these broader systems like racism, sexism. We have 10 questions to help challenge your implicit bias. These are reflection questions to help explore what your own biases are. And then we're going to wrap up with talking about how to address bias in the chapter. And so we can get started with ground rules. We're not going to go super in depth into all of these ground rules, just because as sisters of Tau Beta Sigma, we already have really great ground rules with our ideals, the 5 qualities and 8 essential factors. But ground rules are basically a way to create an inclusive environment and a safe space for having some really difficult conversations, because it's rules that you can set up at the beginning of a conversation so that everyone can feel like they can participate in a safe, psychologically safe manner. And so I'm going to put in the chat a link to a Google Doc that explains some of the ground rules that are on the screen and gives a little bit more information about it, just in case you want to take this back to your chapter room. But like I said, we already have some really great ground rules with our ideals. So
All right, so before we continue, we want to kind of have a good ground foundational definition of implicit bias. So but before we kind of have that full definition, if you don't mind in the chat for a few moments, share any thoughts, your ideas, your definitions of implicit bias. I have one that says biases that we form without realizing it or unintentionally. A few more moments if someone else wants to share. So we're going to create a working definition for our purposes of it. Oh, we have another one: identifying a bias, but not taking steps to make changes or not realizing you're doing that. That's I like that, very action oriented there. This is one of the definitions we'll be using, understanding that there's different nuances to each definition, and you may have, and as we're going, you might shift your ideas there. But this is kind of a working definition that we're going to use for the rest of the workshop. Implicit biases involve associations outside of conscious awareness that lead to negative evaluation of a person on the basis of irrelevant characteristics such as race or gender. That's a big mouthful, but I think some of the folks that put in the chat have with their own personal definitions really help clarify. The keys are there outside of your awareness. It's something that you may not necessarily be aware of, and it typically would have that negative association to it.
And when we were designing this slide, I really wanted this slide to be orange to illustrate one of the biases that I have. So my rival school in college, their colors are orange. And as a rival school, I don't like the color orange because, I don't like them. But that's an example of a bias that I have, towards the color orange. And that could influence, like if I see someone wearing orange, I could be like, ooh, I don't like them, which isn't a good reaction to have. So implicit bias is things that we aren't aware of. So it's really important that we reflect and strive to understand what our biases are, so that we don't let our biases influence how we perceive other people. But I wanted to provide that kind of example of bias and how it could shape the interactions we have with other people. So for our first activity, it's a word scramble activity. So if I could have a volunteer, please read a paragraph that will be on the next slide. So if I can get a volunteer first. Oh, I see. Oh, I'm sorry. I saw Allison's hand first, but it seemed like there was some competition there. I hope
Right, gotta hype it up in this workshop.
So thank you for volunteering, Allison. Dominic, if you could advance the slide, so you'll be reading the paragraph that's on the screen.
If you can read this paragraph, it's because our minds are very good at putting together pieces of information in a way that is easy for us to make sense of. Our minds do this automatically without our conscious control. I like these things, so I'm sorry if I was a bad example of a reader.
But Allison, what do you notice about this paragraph?
So all of the words internally are scrambled, but they have I think consistently have the first and last letter in the correct spot.
Oh my gosh. And you were able to read it perfectly, even though it was kind of the words were scrambled. So, and that's just because of our brain and how our brain works, to make sense of information. Even if it doesn't make sense, our brain can still, because of things like, the first and the last letter being consistent, our brain can still make sense of what it means, even if on the screen the words are scrambled, so it shouldn't make sense. But that's a way to illustrate kind of the way our brain works, to help us process the information that's around us. I did want to take a moment before we move on to our next activity to kind of acknowledge that for some people, they have disabilities that make it really hard for them to read. And so their everyday could be what we're seeing here on the screen. So I did want to kind of acknowledge that perspective. But thank you so much, Allison, for being our volunteer and for reading that for us today.
So we have another activity, and some of you may have already have done this before, but this is called the Stroop test, and it's a psychology-based test. So in psychology, the Stroop effect is a demonstration of cognitive inference when a delay in the reaction time of a task occurs due to mismatch in stimuli. So we saw that earlier in that word scramble. You had that kind of mismatch of with the typos in that sentence. So this is going to be another example of this. And as Caleb acknowledged, folks may struggle with reading this next one and having that. If folks are struggling, have certain visual impairments, this might also be a challenge. So we also want to acknowledge that it's based on color. So we do want to acknowledge that. So this is the first test, and there's going to be 2 series of this on there. So in this experiment, you're required to say the color of the word, not the word it says. For example, for the word that's typed red, you would actually say blue. And for this exercise, why don't we double check that everyone's microphones are muted to start with, and go ahead and try that on your own. So again, you are saying the color of the word, not the word itself. So here's the first example. So for this one, not super challenging. You know, we see the word red, it's colored red. We're going to say red. It's pretty simple. If we see the word blue, it's typed blue, it's the color is blue, is not going to be too challenging. The brown is what we have brown. So I know sometimes the colors may look different on different screens, but for this exercise, that particular shade, we're going to identify as brown. So hopefully you don't have too much of a struggle on here. It did make you pause a little bit, yeah, because I front load that information of really making sure that you say the color, not the word. So you're going to take a little pause before you say that. All right, so we have another set of words here. Just like before, say the color of the word, not what the word says. Again, for the same thing, an example for the word red, you should say blue. And double check that you're still muted. And go ahead and do this on your own again. Looking at the camera view and some nonverbal reactions, significantly more difficult, at least I think, because it has a mismatch of what your visual and what your brain, and it definitely has a processing thing of you have to take a little bit extra processing, even more so than that first one. You see the word brown, but you have to say the word blue. You associate the color within your mind, but it has that mismatch of the perceived color there. So again, another 2 kind of examples of ways that our brains and our ways of thinking are mismatched sometimes of various visual or written cues on there.
I had to unmute myself, so sorry for that pause. But as you see on the screen here, and I'm going to drop a link in the chat that may make this a little bit easier to see. But when I first heard about like the concept of bias, it was in like English class, and we were talking about unreliable narrators, but I never really explored the concept of bias outside of that very specific perspective. So when we were preparing this workshop, I was really shocked that there's like over 100 and I think 188 identified forms of bias that we have, again, that we have in our brains to help us just process the information that's around us. And so if you follow the link, you'll get a clearer version of this codex, this cognitive bias codex, this graphic that was put together. And it's actually linked so that you can click on all of the individual forms of bias and learn a little bit more about it, which it's a very helpful resource. But the biggest takeaways that at this point I want to have with this codex is that there are many different forms of bias. And it's all, again, to help our brain process information. So there are 4 main themes or categories here, and that's biases that help us remember things, biases that help us make sense when there's just too much information that's kind of overwhelming us, biases that help us make meaning when there's not enough meaning just from the information that's provided, and biases that help us make decisions when we need to act fast. So those are the main themes in terms of the different forms of biases, but there's a lot of different types of bias. And again, these are just cognitive processes in our brain. So our brain is using bias to help process this information without us even being aware of it. So that's why, especially, we're going to, in the next slide, bring in some of these systems that may oppress or privilege us. And these biases can help feed into these systems. So that's why it's important to learn about bias, and it's important to reflect on what our biases are. Dominic, was there anything that you wanted to add?
No, and like Caleb was saying, this is a really useful tool if you actually follow the link and then click on the image. All of those are clickable links. So if you're someone like me that gets into a Wikipedia rabbit hole of clicking links and links and links, this is definitely a great tool on there. If you would like to get a little bit more information. We also acknowledge that it is Wikipedia, so use the information as you feel fit on there. All right, so the next piece of it we're going to talk about is watching a video. It's called Peanut Butter, Jelly, and Racism. So it's about a 3-minute video. I'm gonna flip here. Get that pulled up.
Implicit bias.
Implicit bias. Implicit bias. 2016 was the year that implicit bias went somewhat mainstream. Yeah, so when Hillary Clinton mentioned implicit bias in the debates, our phones started blowing up, all our friends started emailing us about it. But what is implicit bias? Implicit biases are basically thought processes that happen without you even knowing it. Little mental shortcuts that hold judgments you might not agree with. And sometimes those shortcuts are based on race. First, some clarity. Saying someone has an implicit bias is different from calling someone a racist. The word racist is a highly loaded term, right, here in American society. A lot of times when people are using it, they're thinking of the kind of old-fashioned Ku Klux Klan style racism. But implicit bias isn't anywhere near that, explicit. Implicit bias is something that comes out of ordinary mental functioning, out of how the mind normally works.
We've all grown up in a culture with media images, news images, conversations we heard at home, our education. Think of that as a fog we've been breathing our whole life. We've never even realized it, what we were taking in.
And that fog causes associations that lead to biases.
I somehow know that if you say peanut butter, I'm going to say jelly. That's an association that's been ingrained in me because throughout my life, peanut butter and jelly are together. And in many forms of media, there's an over-representation of Black men and violent crime being paired together.
And because of that, I actually deep down inside have been taught that Black men are violent and aggressive and not to be trusted, that they're criminals, that they're thugs.
With all those associations, I'm not trying to let us off the hook, but in some ways, none of us stood a chance.
Starting today, we'll post a video a day dealing with one challenge of understanding implicit bias and its relationship to race and exploring ways we might combat the problem. One more thing, if you're seeing this and thinking that it doesn't apply to you, well, you might be falling prey to the blind spot bias. That's a scientific name for a mental bias that allows you to see biases in others, but not in yourself. We're biased.
So does anyone have any initial thoughts on their takeaways? We can either, if you want to put it in the chat, if you want to unmute and say it, but any thoughts or initial takeaways of the video?
I have one initial thought. So of course, Tina Turner recently passed away in the last couple of weeks, and I had never seen her biopic, What's Love Got to Do with It, because I had kind of like a moral standing against it because the film is all about her abuse by a Black man. And that was an image that I just was not interested in seeing because of kind of what it was talking about in the video. We're constantly bombarded with images of Black males and violence. And so I never saw the film, but I felt like I had to finally watch it after 30 years. And it was really good. Angela Bassett should have won an Oscar for it. But that's like an example of not wanting to engage with a piece of media because of its relationship with other medias, and how media can really shape our understanding of Black men or any kind of identity. So that was one thought that I had, was that movie and not wanting to watch it for the longest time.
I think I'm not sure now if my thought is coming off of the video or off of what Caleb just shared, but I think that idea of having a bias that causes avoidance, like I'm thinking at professionally, I work in healthcare administration and I oversee a department of about 400 people, and they all are typically like just after college age individuals. Most of them are focused in the medical field, which is just, it's a medical scribe position, so that's the nature of the position. But in thinking about like hiring practices, or if there are that idea of having a bias that causes avoidance, then you're not only being restrictive and discriminatory in your hiring practices and then how you build your team, but also cutting out that perspective and that really needed perspective on what an experience can look like or how a community and team should be shaped. So I hadn't thought about, when I normally think of bias, I think of it from I guess from like a more, I'm trying to think through because I have a lot of thoughts actually flooding in right now about this. But I usually think of it more in I guess it is always in like, in my mind, it's more of an I don't want to associate with that thing. But even in how we approach like art and people around us and just regular connections, it impacts so many things. Sorry, this was just a brain vent right now, and I don't think I came around to a specific point, but I think that gut reaction to avoid causes so many issues within the systems that we have in place that impact, of course, those individuals that are being avoided, but also impact the system. So it's a negative feedback loop.
No, I appreciate it, and kind of talking through, because I think a lot of us are processing different things. And I think that avoidance is kind of a natural thing. You're not, if it's going to be put you place in a sense of being uncomfortable or maybe not sure how to react or how to talk or to engage with other folks. I think that's a pretty normal reaction to those things. And especially like in a professional setting or that, I think that's definitely has that added layer of, this is a workplace, man, have those expectations of a professional thing. So I appreciate it. And these are, as we have these conversations, that's all about. This is kind of some of the goals, is just to have those initial thoughts, the conversations, and build upon each other. It's on there. So yeah. But yeah, that's I appreciate the comments and thoughts on there. Now, sometimes I might associate peanut butter with chocolate, but that's just me. But on there, but just kind of thinking, yeah, just that thought of whether it's the media, whether it's your upbringing, your culture, the city you live in, how it, how you unconsciously start associating things. I think we all can associate a green light with go and a red light with stop, and that's and maybe we were taught that a while ago, but probably even before, if you're a driver, probably associated that way before you even got in front of the wheel. So, and you just kind of pick up those cues and thoughts and notions on there. So I know we kind of talked a little, if we want to tackle that second question a little bit, and how can implicit bias shape broader systems like racism, sexism, heterosexism, things like all the other isms. Is there anyone have a thought there? Now, it's a little bit bigger question than some initial thoughts of the video.
I think that one thing that I have found because we are talking more in public forums about implicit biases, is that many of the things that, we were willing to kind of sidestep previously are now becoming things that, like we talk about, like things that didn't age well. And so that's everything from songs that didn't age well, even stand-up comedians, or like, jokes that they told back, several years ago, that they're now having to almost kind of apologize for now. And so I think it's interesting to me that in, a very polarizing time right now in the United States specifically, that is something that is a reality right now. I don't think we ever thought we'd ever get to this point. It was just kind of like, it's free flow, do what you want, freedom of speech, that's the end of it. But now, like, people are having to actually answer to some of those things that didn't, things from the past that didn't age well. So yeah, I don't know if that's a well thought out thought, but I mean, that is an impression that I think I get. Yeah.
And I'm personally rewatching Modern Family, and I have several examples of like, ooh, if this was, this probably wouldn't be a scenario or a scene if it was produced today. So definitely, as you keep going through things on that, you're like, and that's kind of a change in the culture, change in the times, and change in thoughts and how those relationships and things develop as we develop. And you're also a different person from 5 years, 10 years. You have different lived experiences and things like that. So definitely can change perspectives on there.
Sarah, I saw your hand up.
Thank you. I was just going to add that for the second question, I think that implicit biases, because they're that fog that we don't consciously recognize, when, like, I'm deep in the world of education, so like when we're trying to restructure something, our implicit biases, like, we have to be very aware of them to prevent ourselves from making a system that is doing the exact same thing that the current system is doing. So if we are not actively trying to identify and interrupt our implicit biases, then they will naturally get into whatever systems, bigger systems. I know you have racism, sexism, and heterosexism on there, but like, they're everywhere. They're in any system, because it's just like rooted perspective that someone had when they made the choices that built up. So it's woven into everything, unfortunately.
No, for sure. And it's just kind of always in the culture and in your mind and your thoughts, and it's challenging to first of all recognize it, and then what to do next. That I think is also a challenge there.
And Sarah, your last comment really ties nicely into this next slide that we have about socialization, because we all inherited a world that created these systems before our grandparents were twinkles in their parents' eyes, you know. So socialization is this idea of how we come to understand our culture, how we come to understand how to navigate the world. And it begins before we're even born. So for example, gender reveal parties, I'm not a big fan of, because people are prescribing genders onto babies who haven't been born yet and have no understanding of what their own gender is. This idea that, you know, blue is a boy's color, pink is a girl's color. That's an example of how people are born into these expectations that may not, you know, once they grow up and understand themselves, may not align with who they actually are. But socialization begins before we're born. And as we navigate different institutions like education, like our families, we come to learn different customs. We come to learn different, like I said before, ways to navigate the world. And our understanding of the world is then reinforced with things like media, like the peanut butter and jelly video was talking about. And it results in this understanding of how to approach a situation that may not be the best way of understanding, kind of what Erica was speaking to earlier with different like jokes that you may have found funny, that's not actually funny, that's actually really harmful. And so at a certain point, we are confronted with either wanting to change a system or just continue to feed back into a system. And understanding your implicit biases can help you be able to make those decisions of when am I going to continue a system versus when do I need to disrupt the system. And so socialization is all about reflecting and understanding how you came to where you are today, and how where you are was influenced by all of these greater factors that you were just born into. And that speaks to the point that the person in the peanut butter and jelly video made about how sometimes like we never had a chance just because of all of these systems that have been in place that we now have to navigate. So it's important to understand socialization, to understand implicit bias and how to change the narrative and how to change those systems. And so now we're going to get into, oh, Dominic, I think this was your slide, actually. Sorry.
It's fine. So this is another another activity that you can use for personal reflection. This is also a great way if you want to bring it to your chapters to do some things as well. There are 10 questions. In the interest of our time, we're not going to spend the next 20 minutes for folks to reflect on every question, but definitely just some tools that you can use on there. And some of the conversations that we've been having earlier, this is a kind of a push to have that next step on there. I know we talked about that blind spot or a little bit of avoidance. Some of these questions address okay, no, have that piece of reflecting of, okay, why am I not maybe engaging on that, on things like that. So I don't know, we can spend a few minutes if folks want to maybe choose one of the questions, think about it, and do like a personal reflection for the next few moments. And I know Caleb dropped a document in the chat as well, a Google Doc that you can definitely use to share out on these. If it gives it a little graph way that you can, and that one has some example responses as well. But you could definitely use that worksheet and have folks fill that out on there. So I know sometimes that's nice if say there's a question that you don't necessarily, you're unsure of what it's really asking, to have that perspective on there. So if you can utilize that. Okay. Anyone has an initial thought or want to share a notion from any of the questions? We'll give that space. If not, we can push it on. And number 8 directly relates, if you think back to one of our expectations, kind of that have that conversation, make sure you're in the presence to make. I know number 3, I don't do I know what specific terms actually mean? At least for my thoughts, we had a little bit of discussion of maybe I'm not 100% sure how to say something or that's gonna maybe work on some personal exploration for those kinds of things. The increased awareness, even just having these discussions or having that pause of, let's start naming that in our mind. Oh, that could potentially be to have that first step of, let's identify those things, naming it, so then we can maybe reframe or change those notions. Okay.
I was muted, sorry about that. This is the last topic that we wanted to talk about today, and bringing bias back into your chapters, how to address bias in the chapter. And so I have just a couple of ways to start thinking about bias and how it can impact chapter operations, but I want this to be a discussion. So I invite any other thoughts that you have about how to address bias in your chapter. But our mission statement reads, we promote equality and diversity. So how do you actually enable that in your chapter? How do you learn about different identities that are represented in your band program or in your campus, the people that you serve? How do you take time to learn about those identities? And so maybe you have an office on your campus that educates the campus community around diversity, equity, inclusion. I know in every state there may be legislation that prevents campuses from having those kind of offices. But if you ever want to do education around different identities in your chapter, and you may not have those resources on your campus, Tau Beta Sigma does have a diversity, equity, and inclusion and accessibility committee. And so, we'd be happy to partner with you all to have education around different identities, taking time to discuss personal biases that you have, biases that your chapter has collectively, and how that can shape recruitment, how that can shape how you compose the people who are in your chapter. So an example of this, when I was an active member, my chapter, we were known as TBS was where all the clarinets went. We had other musical organizations, so like SAI was where all the piccolos went, KKSI was where all the saxophones went. So we had like biases in our recruitment about what sections we recruited from, as opposed to striving to have a diverse chapter where all sections are represented. So like that's an example of a bias that your chapter can have that then shapes recruitment practices. And the last suggestion there was creating rules around conflict management. So this goes back to the ground rules that we talked about briefly at the beginning. But as part of your process for building those ground rules, having those conversations around how to manage conflict when it does occur, because it will occur, integrating bias conversations into that, and how just through some of the forms of bias that we all have that can shape how we navigate that conflict. So just having those kind of conversations. So those were just, oh, Allison, I see your hand is up.
Sorry, you could finish your thought. I just had a separate thought. I didn't mean to interrupt you.
Oh, well, I was wrapping up there. What are your thoughts around how to address bias in your chapters?
Well, I think that for the second bullet point, especially, and it ties into your example of being within specific sections, I think that every single chapter should have these types of conversations and think, does our chapter reflect what the band program looks like in all forms of diversity, whether it's by section, by ensemble that receive service from the chapters. Then does the band program reflect what the college looks like? Like, is there diversity in the different types of students that are able to participate? Are there barriers to access to being able to participate in the band programs? And then similarly from the band program into the chapter. And then does the band program represent, or it did band to school, right? Then does the school represent the greater community? And there may be specific instances where there's going to be just population shifts based on where the school is located or other things. But I think that kind of cascade, like the chapter should reflect all of the different communities that it's a part of. And if it doesn't, start to ask questions of why, what can we do? How are we able to either ask for help and support from the DEIA committee, from the DEIA office, from directors of bands, et cetera, to help to make that happen and shift that culture change. It won't be overnight, but those conversations get the ball rolling.
Yes, Sarah.
Just to add on to that, one of the ideas I was having as you were going through this slide was, I think it would be awesome and informative for our students if they analyzed, are we getting feedback from diverse stakeholders? Like when we hold an event and we try to get feedback, and maybe it's happening informally and they're just talking to people who were there or talking to people after the fact, are they only getting feedback from a small subsection and then that's reinforcing, okay, we like what we're doing or it's going well, but they haven't really gotten the perspective from different subgroups, again, whether instrumentation, race, gender, etc. And I love, and I wrote down what you said about integrate addressing bias into conflict resolution, because it's just a thought that hasn't occurred to me. And I work with our students a lot on conflict resolution and being intentional about like having, let's check our bias, or let's do some reflective work before we come to this conversation around our biases and how they might have impacted the situation. That seems huge. That's so exciting to think about, like getting through that layer so that the conflict can really be resolved in a meaningful way. So thank you. I feel like I had something else to say, but it's lost me. So, or I've lost it. So I'll mute.
Thank you both. Any other thoughts that people have around addressing bias in chapter? All right. Well, I know we are coming up on our time. So I want to be respectful of everyone's time. Thank you all for being here today. If you'd like to continue the conversation, please don't hesitate to email Dominic or I, or you can email deia@tbsigma.org. We'd love to continue these conversations and together work towards, creating a more inclusive and a more self-aware Tau Beta Sigma.
For sure, yeah. And if you need help with resources, if you need help, we can help facilitate those resources. Come, we can do a Zoom during a chapter meeting. Definitely, we have a pretty active committee that is definitely here to support all these causes on your campus and in your chapter. So, but thank you for some great conversations on this topic, and it can look like a daunting task, but even a little bit of conversation can go a long way on these things.
All right. Well, thank you to Caleb and to Dominic, and to the whole DEIA committee and community for your support of our chapters and for really being a wonderful resource for the organization as we move forward. I do want to add a little preview that there's going to be a dedicated landing page with various DEIA content on the national website. It's not just yet ready. We're working on the last few graphics, but that should be coming out soon. But thank you both so much for your time.